Hey everyone, friend of the podcast, Carl Bonner is a mixing engineer who helps other producers and mixers find, attract, and build better relationships with clients who are making the kind of music you are most passionate about. He recently began developing a course based on how he trains the Spotify algorithm to make super accurate recommendations for you to find potential artists to work with. And he's giving it all away for free while it's still a work in progress. So go to carlbonner.com/coaching to learn more, and I'll have a link for that in the show notes. So go check it out. Hey everyone, welcome back to Secret Sonics. This is episode 129 with Steve Ornest. I had a great chat with Steve. We talked about so many things, including getting started young, meeting famed producer Wyn Davis, forming a relationship with him, and eventually partnering up as a co-owner of Total Access Recording with him. We talked about tapping into local talent, being a connector and not just a producer. We talked about working with Mixerman and Ken Scott, meeting with artists in person and not just over the phone. We talked about outsourcing, being a conduit for the artists you work with, being a workaholic and being present, taking breaks. We talked about his new rehearsal space, Total Access Rehearsals, zooming out and appreciating the journey, and so much more. So tons of great stuff here. We really covered a lot of ground. I think you're going to love this conversation. So with all that to say, here's my conversation with Steve Ornest here on Secret Sonics. You're listening to Secret Sonics, a podcast exploring the creative side of music production. Join us weekly for honest conversations with real-world music producers and audio professionals. Hello, and welcome back to Secret Sonics. I'm your host, Ben Wallach. My guest today is Steve Ornest. Steve is a music producer, engineer, and multi-instrumentalist, and the co-owner of Total Access Recording and Total Access Rehearsals in Redondo Beach, California. I recently heard Steve on a podcast episode of The Six Figure Creative, and I really enjoyed what he had to say, so I invited him on the air onto my podcast, and he's graciously agreed to do so. So with all that to say, welcome to Secret Sonics, Steve.
Thanks so much for having me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you kind of told your story on The Six Figure Creative and how it was kind of like a rom-com.
Cheesy rom-coms. Yeah, exactly.
A cheesy rom-com upcoming, but I'd love for you to tell it on my podcast as well. You can say it as briefly as you want to say it, but yeah, it's a cool story.
Thanks, man. Yeah, so I basically grew up fascinated by music from an early age. I mean, I remember like my earliest childhood memory was when I was like 2 or 3 years old, finding my mom's vinyl collection and like learning how to put the records on and actually play them myself, and listening to everything that was popular in the late 80s, early 90s, like Michael Jackson and Madonna and just all that stuff, and classic rock stuff like the Rolling Stones and Beatles, and just being like infatuated. And that's all I wanted to do was listen to music, and soon started playing piano, and then years later switched to guitar. The rom-com part of this is that by the time I got to high school, I was already playing with a lot of bands. Even as like a 13, 14-year-old, I was going out, and I was like in some cover band at the time that was like an 80s rock cover band with guys that were like in their 40s. And anyway, I used to go to school like, I looked like the guitar player kid. I had long hair and, it just looked ridiculous. I looked like a cartoon character of like what someone thought Slash might have looked like when he was, 14 with the hair and like the leather pants and like the whole 9 yards. Like it was, it was pretty awesome. Like my wife tells me now, if she would have met me then, this never would have happened. So it was special. But anyway, I would, like cut class and just like sit on the bleachers and play guitar. And one of the days that I was doing that, I had like this little mini Marshall with me, so I could hear myself while I was playing. This girl came up to me and said, "Hey, you sound really good. You should meet my dad." And I said, "Oh, who is he?" And she said his name, Wyn Davis. So I went home and like looked up who he was and saw that he had worked with like Dio and Guns N' Roses and all of these bands that I loved at the time. So I went back to school and was like, "Yes, please introduce me, to your dad." So she brought him to a local show that I was playing at. And long story short, he gave me his card. I went to the studio. I met him for the first time, saw the studio, was super overwhelmed by just everything. I think he was mixing like a Black Label Society DVD. So it was like I could hear Zakk Wylde coming through the speakers. And for a 14-year-old, I was like, oh my God, this is crazy.
Especially like back then before we had access to everything on the internet.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sure, the internet existed, but it wasn't the same place, right? Like I heard Zakk Wylde's guitar when I was 14, I'd go wild. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Nice pun too, man.
Yeah, I had to do it, right?
Yeah,
it was good. It was Unstoppable.
Right. And so, yeah, so Wyn he sort of took me under his wing and would call me when he needed someone to play on things. And I got to play on some pretty cool records, even as like a young guy. And then, one of the times, so my mom, of course, because I was still a pup, I was like 14, was dropping me off to the studio and picking me up later. And one of those times she went in and met Wyn, and that story is the two of them wound up falling in love and getting married. And there's your cheesy rom-com, which was crazy unto itself. But in any event, you fast forward, and I wound up going to Berkeley and Boston for a couple of years and sort of finding out that, just to rewind actually for a second, even in high school when I was playing guitar for all these bands, I would show up to like kids' houses with my little like 8-track digital recorder, and I would charge them like $50 and just spend like a day recording. I had little idea what I was doing, but I was just using my ears to record songs and get them to make me feel excited, and started getting quite good at it. And then, Wyn, at one point, I think when I was like 15, called me and said, hey, some local Japanese songwriter is working on these song demos, and they're a little bit wacky, but this might be a good opportunity for you just to like really cut your teeth, as a guitar player. Because at the time, if you would have told me like as a recording engineer, I'd be like, you're crazy. I don't want to do that, So I started working with her, and I upgraded my system. So I had a little Pro Tools rig, like a little Digi 002, and started having singers come over to the house and recording them, and got really comfortable with Pro Tools. Going, fast forwarding again, by the time I went to Berkeley, and everyone's like the hero in their zip code on their instrument, everyone's so talented, started finding that the thing that like really set me apart was the fact that I could turn things in that sounded like they were fully produced. And I had just recorded them like in my little attic apartment that I was living in, because I had years of experience doing it. And I knew how to record guitar, and I knew how to record a vocal. And
were you there around the same time as Fernando Ladero? Because I feel like he's also your age and was at Berkeley. I don't know if you know him.
I don't know him personally, but it's possible. It's crazy how many people I run into now in LA that are like, you went to Berkeley what year? And I'll tell them, and they're like, man, I was there the same time. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's crazy,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Also Travis Ferens comes to mind, who also has a great podcast, Progressions. I don't know if you know him.
Oh, cool. I didn't know. I don't. I'll have to check that out.
All right. Well, I'll have to introduce you guys.
Yeah, man. So I wound up coming back to, to California, and I put a band together and started recording some of the stuff at the studio, and I was still playing for other artists as well. But pretty quickly, like my focus became way more on like being in the studio, arranging, writing, working with other artists, and at first, super fearful because it was terrifying being, in that environment where you're responsible for someone else's like, their vision and just being a part of that. And especially in a place like Total Access, which is different from being like in an attic recording studio, But starting around like 2021, 20 or 21 years old, I started seriously like working as like a producer and recording engineer and taking it seriously. And then it sort of took over everything, and fast forward, and now I run the studio. So it's been a crazy journey.
Wow. Tell me a little bit about that transition from, just being a producer to kind of being a co-owner of Total Access with Wyn. What did that look like?
Yeah. So I think that there was a conversation we had probably about 10 years ago when I was in my like mid 20s, where we went out. I actually remember it was like my birthday, and we went out for dinner, and he was like, Steve, sort of want to talk to you about something. Like there's going to be a point where I'm not going to want to be in this room anymore. It's been like 30 something years that he had at that point already been doing this, and he had opened the studio in 81, and, he's like, I'm still going to be involved for a while, as far as I know, but I just, I'm just sort of curious, like what you think. And it sort of was like a rude awakening for me, because I think for those 4 or 5 years up to that point, I was like, I'd say that I was still 50% at that point, 50% in the studio and 50% like gigging with artists and, doing all sorts of other things to make it make sense.
Sure.
And then like pretty much after that conversation, something just clicked in my head where I was like, I can do this. Like, I know that this is in a sense like something I'd been training for my whole life. I just never really stopped and realized it, that this might actually be like the right path for me to go down. And I think I realized that the most important thing for me to do, because we still had at that point a lot of like legacy artists that had been coming to Wyn for years that I started working with him. But like really what was going to help me sort of make my name and sort of launch the studio into the future was by trying to reinvigorate like a local music scene. Because we're not actually in LA. We're not in Hollywood. We're like 35 miles south in Redondo Beach, which is just a small like beach community.
This is still north of like Orange County, right?
It is. Yeah, exactly. Like
Okay.
Huntington Beach is technically, I believe, Seal Beach maybe is like where that the cutoff is, and that's like 12 or 15 miles south of us. So we're still LA County. But it's far from, like if you're in the valley or something and you're used to recording at any one of the studios in Hollywood, it's a bit of a commitment getting down here, and plenty of people do. But with all that said, there's so much talent here in the beach cities, like Redondo Beach, Hermosa, Torrance, Long Beach. Like there's just so much music. And there have been periods of time in the last 25 years where it was really celebrated, like the punk scene and a lot of the artists we worked with, like Pennywise and then Sublime and, a lot of like the Long Beach scene and all that. But it's like, like any sort of trend like that, when that fizzles a little bit, then people sort of forget that area was like really cool at a time. And there's so many young, talented people around here. So I've been really tapping into that for like the last 8 or 10 years and trying to help sort of recreate something down here.
I love that. I feel like these days, for me personally, I'm trying to like expand my, clientele of working with artists, abroad, not just because my local scene is very small, right? I'm in Jerusalem, which is not even the biggest city in Israel in terms of like a music scene. And, if I'm only working for local stuff, I'm not only doing music. I'm also doing podcast work. I'm also doing, random recordings, random stuff.
Right.
So in order for me to kind of do more music, I need to look out. And I know a lot of people are doing that these days. So it's really badass that you're kind of able to kind of foster the local turf and, get something from that. Yeah. There's actually an interesting book. I don't know if you read this, but David Byrne has a book. I think it's called How Music Works.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I read that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Awesome. Okay, cool. So he has like a whole chapter of like how to make a scene. Do you remember that?
I don't. I just remember reading that, but I know that I still have it at the studio. But yeah, I'll have to go back and check it out.
It sounds like maybe worth revisiting.
Yeah, totally, man.
I remember reading that and being like, man, I don't think my city could possibly do this. This is so cool. It's like talking about like CBGBs in like the 80s and how like New York was able to foster like the Talking Heads,
right? Yeah, totally.
And like having a club where any artist that's blooming could play without like much in the way, and also people are hanging out and watching it and observing it and like creating like a local sound almost. I don't know. I thought it was like a really cool chapter.
Yeah, and I don't know. I feel like some of that. No city is just all of a sudden set up with that. Like there are definitely places in LA right now that have much more of that than the South Bay. I mean, it'd be easier in a sense if I was in like Highland Park or Echo Park or Silver Lake, where everything is it's super gentrified and there's coffee shops everywhere and all these little small venues popping up and like coffee shops with record players. And like, it's just, that's the vibe that's going on. But in some ways, because that's like so cool and so hip, I feel like there's an oversaturation of everything. I mean, it's just like there's so much music happening there that might be a bit overwhelming. And for me, I sort of found that because there is so much talent down here, even though there's some elements that we're missing, like a great venue, which we finally have again, because we had a local venue for years called St. Rock, and it closed during the pandemic. But I have a relationship with someone who just opened or has been at a venue that's in San Pedro, and it now has like a state-of-the-art sound system. And she's really making a go of like having something locally that's going to be important for, cultivating this scene. So there's a few of us that are like really pushing for this. It's definitely not just me.
Yeah. I mean, have you had any, I don't know, do you have any like takeaways from like trying to build up a scene of like what works, how to foster it?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, I mean, first of all, of course, is just like getting started and trying to hone in on something that maybe like you're really good at. Like for me, I think that's working with like rock bands and singer-songwriters and sort of like find the genre, find your niche, the thing that you already are good at. And then, of course, like go and, find local talent, which even though there weren't a lot of venues in the area, there was like one sort of coffee shop kind of venue where a lot of people would come and play acoustic versions of their full band and like things like that. And for a long time, I would just go there. And I was like there whenever I was done recording or with my daily session, I'd go down and just hang out. And you can definitely find talent that way. The other thing is like making relationships with other people that are either trying to do the same thing as you or can maybe help in some other facet. Like for me, it was like making relationships with the couple venue owners and making a relationship with, we have a rock radio station here called K-Rock. I made a relationship with a woman who runs the locals program, Kat Corbett, where I would send her stuff that I was working on. And she was very honest. Like, yeah, this is great. I'm going to play it. Or, this is good, but it just doesn't fit our format or whatever. But through cultivating that, you then have like a few different outlets that you can use, like when you're working with an artist, to maybe help them beyond just like make a record. Like maybe you can say, hey, there's a showcase coming up at this